Thank you, David. Thank you, Shri and Faryar. Covered a lot of ground there. And we're going to be shifting gears now to our trade segment. And as we shift out our chairs here, I did want to just say a word of appreciation first to our sponsors, SICPA Holdings, this year's main event sponsor, for their generous investment in our program and their continued support for the Bretton Woods Committee, and also Soros Fund Management as well as a contributor to this year's event. The IMF Communications team for hosting us and partnering with us on this meeting. And of course, our committee secretariat team. We do a lot with a little, you probably realize by now. And our deputy director, Emily Slater, has really held this program together this year. So thank you. I'm going to now pass it over to Bill Rhodes, who will introduce Ambassador Froman.
It's a great pleasure to have Ambassador Mike Froman with us here today. He is one of the key players in the world on international trade, and he has a lot of things going. TPP in Asia, trying to get approval for that. Also TTIP in Europe, and in fact he has the EU negotiator coming here tomorrow to talk with him. Not to speak of trying to work on a investment treaty with China. Mike has done a great job, as I said, in his present role, but he also was in the White House in the first Obama term, working on international economic affairs, advising the president. I had a good chance to work with him both on the KORUS FTA, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, as well as negotiations with Brazil. And so we're very fortunate that he's with us here today. So Mike, would you please come up? And then we'll have some questions afterwards.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. And it's an honor to be here, talk about the importance of U.S. leadership with this distinguished group. I think the title for that previous session of multilateral cooperation in a turbulent world seems to be particularly timely at the moment. In many parts of the global economy, growth is uneven and weak. In China, progress on reform seems uncertain. Russia and Brazil continue to face headwinds. And in Europe, between the migrant crisis, the lingering effects of the financial crisis, the rise of Euroscepticism, and now the vote by the British people to leave the European Union, these are turbulent times indeed. One of the greatest concerns we have is that in the last couple of years, global trade has slowed. Rather than driving global growth, trade is growing at a slower pace than the economy as a whole. A revival of international trade is indispensable if full employment is to be achieved in a peaceful world and with standards of living which will permit the realization of man's reasonable hopes. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Henry Morgenthau at the end of the Bretton Woods Conference, but they continue to resonate today. Here at home, we've been growing for the longest uninterrupted period in recorded history, and we're doing so at the high end of the spectrum among industrialized economies. Over the last 6 years, we've added 14 million new jobs and cut unemployment from 10% to under 5%. Manufacturing output is an all-time high, and we've marked our 6th consecutive year of net manufacturing job growth, the longest uninterrupted streak since the 1960s, adding over 850,000 manufacturing jobs to the U.S. economy. And wages have finally begun to tick up, 2.5% last year, and seem to be on the same track thus far this year. Again, too little, too slowly, but at least it's a positive trend. Still, there's a great deal of anxiety out there, evident in the current election dynamic in the United States, not to mention much of the developed world. And some of that is certainly rooted in economics. Between the changing composition of jobs in the United States, 15 years of wage stagnation and rising income inequality, there's a concern that the system may be working for a few, but not the many, that the game is rigged, and that other countries don't follow the same rules we do, but instead act unfairly. that the economic recovery of the last 6 or 7 years hasn't found its way to many Americans. It's important that we not ignore these concerns. They are real and legitimate, and the question is, what do we do about them? Most economists will tell you that automation has more to do with the changing nature of the workforce and the suppression of wages than globalization, but certainly both contribute. The problem is that we don't get to vote on automation. Nobody votes on the next generation of computers. Nobody votes on when the next generation of robots should be deployed. Nor do we really get to vote on globalization. It's a process made possible by the containerization of shipping, the spread of broadband, the opening of economies like China and Eastern Europe that had been closed to the rest of the world and are now integrated to the global economy. Globalization is a force that you can't wish away or put the genie back in the bottle. What we do get to vote on are trade agreements. So they become the vessel into which people pour their legitimate anxieties about the changing nature of the workforce, wage stagnation, and income inequality. They become the magnets of concern for a much broader and largely unrelated set of factors. But trade agreements aren't the cause of the problems I've alluded to. They can be part of the solution to them, along with other sound economic and domestic policies, such as investment in infrastructure, education, and training. Trade agreements allow us to shape globalization to our advantage. They're the vehicle through which we help write the rules of the road for the global trading system, which reflect our interests and our values. We start from the fact that the U.S. already has one of the most open economies in the world, in large part because decisions made decades ago and supported by 12 presidents since, 6 of whom happen to be Democrats and 6 of whom happen to be Republicans. Our average applied tariff is less than 1.5%, and we don't use regulations as a disguised barrier for trade. But when we look abroad, we see markets that are shielded by higher tariffs and opaque and slanted regulatory systems. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we can level that playing field by removing barriers to those markets, raise standards in them, and as a result, increase our export-related jobs, which pay 18% more on average than non-export-related jobs. Right now, we compete with low-wage countries all over the world, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? TPP will open up some of the largest and fastest growing economies to our manufactured goods, agricultural products, and services exports. It will, for the first time, take a comprehensive approach to imposing disciplines on state-owned enterprises so that when they compete against our private firms, they'll have to do so on a fair and level playing field. It will, for the first time, take on the issues of the digital economy, the free flow of data, pushing back against digital protectionism, maintaining an internet that's open and free. And it has the strongest ever labor and environmental provisions, strengthening workers' rights and protecting the environment, and does so in a manner that is fully enforceable. But all of these provisions underscore that there's something broader at issue in whether and when TPP moves forward. It's the rules-based system itself. And no group of people understands the importance of the rules-based system better than this one. The principles of open markets, shared responsibility, and shared benefits animated the Bretton Woods Conference 72 years ago. And the rules-based system put in place then allowed Japan and the countries throughout Europe to rebuild themselves after the war. It allowed developing countries like South Korea and Brazil to become emerging economies. It helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. As successful as it's been, we can't take that system for granted. We cannot be complacent about it or expect it to endure if we turn inward, because there are alternatives being promoted, alternatives that are more statist, more mercantilist in nature. From our perspective, it's very important that we maintain and strengthen the rules-based system, where every country has certain rights, where all countries are expected to play by the same set of rules. And if they don't, where there's fair and equitable resolution of disputes, where big countries can't push little ones around. That system is key to maintaining a stable and prosperous Asia-Pacific region. It's also key to ensuring that the global economy is working for our workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses. And it's critically important that we're not just sitting on the sidelines, but proactively shaping the global economy in a way that reflects our interests and our values. If the United States were to turn inward, the results would be economically devastating. History has proven beyond a doubt that protectionism doesn't work. Raising tariffs on our trading partners would lead those countries to respond in kind and block our exports. That is a trade war, and we know that no one wins a trade war. Turning to protectionism would not increase employment here, it would reduce it. It wouldn't boost economic growth, it would retard it at best and drive the economy into recession at worst. And we know this from experience. In 1930, Congress passed and President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which essentially walled off the United States from imports. The thinking was that that would lead to a resurgence of manufacturing and employment in the United States. We had a spectacular trade surplus then, and the Great Depression. The high tariffs worsened the Great Depression in the United States. It contributed to the decline of the global economy, which in turn led to the rise of nationalism in Europe. The economic stakes of isolationism are clear, but so are the strategic stakes. Rejecting TPP would undermine U.S. leadership, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but around the world. Our allies around the world couldn't help but question whether we had the wherewithal to make good on our commitments. As Singapore Prime Minister Lee put it, if you're not prepared to deal when it comes to cars and services and agriculture, can we depend on you when it comes to security and military arrangements? The good news is that as I meet with members of Congress, they're increasingly appreciating the benefits of the agreement to their constituents, as well as the costs of not ratifying it this year. The costs of delay are high. We already see our market share in priority products eroded by other countries that already have preferential access to key markets. The Peterson Institute has estimated that a one-year delay in putting TPP in place would impose a $94 billion cost on the U.S. economy. That equates to about a $700 tax on every American household. And moreover, if we don't get it done soon, the other Asia-Pacific countries aren't going to just sit around and wait for us. As New Zealand's Prime Minister Key put it, these economies aren't going to stand still. Beijing will step in to fill the void. The negotiations of RCEP, China's TPP equivalent, are well underway with a major push to get it done this year. And not surprisingly, it doesn't raise labor and environmental standards. It doesn't impose disciplines on SOEs. It doesn't require the free flow of data across borders and a free and open internet. And it doesn't strengthen intellectual property rights protections. I always ask opponents of TPP a simple question. Do they think we're better off living in a world where those are the rules of the road? Because the choice isn't between TPP and the status quo. It's between TPP and what's likely to evolve in the absence of TPP. And that cannot be in the interests of American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses more than moving ahead with TPP. Pierre Mendès-France, the minister who represented France at Bretton Woods, said, "To govern is to choose." And today our government has a choice. We can write the rules of the road for 40% of the global economy, or we can leave that job to others whose values and interests don't necessarily align with ours. We can move forward with TPP, or we can walk away and be remembered as the generation that inflicted a crippling wound on America's leadership in the Asia-Pacific region and around the world. China is executing on its strategy, RCEP, the One Belt, One Road initiative, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other regional initiatives. We are one vote away from cementing our leadership in the Asia-Pacific region or ceding that role to others. It's just that simple. And that doesn't strike me as being a difficult choice. Now, before I stop, I'd like to say a few words about TTIP in the aftermath of the vote in the UK. People of the United Kingdom have made their choice. Our relationship with the UK will remain special, and our relationship with the EU will remain strong and enduring. We are currently evaluating the effect of Brexit on the TTIP negotiations. The economic and strategic rationale for TTIP remains strong. We've made a lot of progress on the agreement during the last 8 months, and our goal remains to continue working with the EU to conclude an ambitious, comprehensive, and high-standard agreement this year. To do so, we're going to need a creative, pragmatic approach to resolving the outstanding issues, not ideology. The Europeans have a lot on their plate: the Brexit vote, the migrant crisis, the rise of skepticism about Brussels and other difficult issues. And we sympathize with them and hope that they can summon the needed focus and political will to get this done. Indeed, there's more at stake now than ever before, given the questions that are being raised about the nature and future of the European Union. Can the EU deliver for its people? Can it take the bold actions necessary to promote the kinds of growth and jobs clearly being demanded across Europe and create the future opportunities its young people in particular need to thrive? Will the EU be able to play a leadership role in defending the open, rules-based system, raising the standards for the global economy. It's very much in the interest of the United States that we have the strongest possible Europe as a partner, outwardly facing, capable of working together with us to pursue our shared interests and values. That's certainly true in the economic arena. It's equally true across a range of security, transnational, and strategic matters. Turbulence is often unavoidable. The question is, how do we manage it? There's a great deal at stake in the answer to that question. Over the years, there's been no more important voice for the responsible management of turbulence than the Bretton Woods Committee, and I look forward to working with you through this important period. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike, for making, as always, a very positive case for the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well as TTIP in Europe. I guess I have two questions before I turn it over to the audience, so I'm sure has a lot of questions. There's somewhat of a confusion with some of the statements that President Obama made, when he was obviously trying to help Prime Minister Cameron to get the Remain option adopted by the British people. And he talked about being at the, UK being at the end of the line with the discussions with the EU. He was very positive on the special relationship with the EU. Do you see it as a possibility that you could be negotiating with both the EU as well as the UK at the same time, or does one need to come before the other, or this is something that has to be worked out based on what happens over the coming weeks and months?
I think you probably answered the question yourself. Our focus is on negotiating these platform agreements, TPP and TTIP, both of which are intended to be open ultimately to other parties who are able and willing to meet the standards. And so that's where our focus is. And obviously, there's a lot to be worked out between the UK and the EU in the coming weeks and months to determine exactly how they're going to interact with their respective trading partners.
I think just moving on to Asia and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so much progress has been made by you and your equivalents in Asia over the last years, months. One of the problems that a lot of people see, and I was in a meeting recently with some of the chief trade people, both under President Clinton and President Bush, and when they see the statements of the major candidates, Hillary Clinton, who at one point, I sat next to her when she made a comment a few years ago that this was sort of the golden, let's say, possibility for a trade agreement, TPP, but she has come out against it, Bernie Sanders very much, and obviously Donald Trump. And so how do you see that affecting the congressional vote? Because it's one thing for candidates to say something, when they're running for office, for an election, presidential election. It's another to the impact that they will have on Congress going forward when this vote takes place.
Well, look, I think I'm spending a lot of my time up on Capitol Hill meeting individually with members of Congress and in groups with members of Congress. And I think the good news is that fundamentally, members of Congress are focused on what's the impact of the agreement on their constituents and on key stakeholders. What's the impact of not approving the agreement on those constituents and key stakeholders? And as we walk through what's in there, there's a very good reception on their behalf for what they see there. And it goes to the issue of timing as well. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Australia has a free trade agreement already with Japan. So Australia beef exports to Japan face a lower tariff than we do. And as a result, our market share is declining in Japan. The longer we wait to approve TPP, the more that differential will, the wider that differential will be, the more we'll lose market share. Already we're losing over $125 million of exports each year. That will only grow in time. When members of Congress from rural areas who have beef producers in their district hear that, understand that, hear it most importantly from their cattlemen, it tends to focus their attention on how are we going to get this done and when. And like you can multiply that by dozens of sectors and dozens of countries. So there's, I think, we're building the support there. We're answering questions. We're working with congressional leadership. I think at the end of the day there, I'm confident the votes will be there, but we've got to get it done this year.
I guess final question that I have, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. As you know, there's a lot of support for an investment treaty with China. How do you see that fitting in, this possibility? And you were just in China, and I know you were talking with the Chinese about this, with the whole TTP effort.
Well, it's on a parallel track. We've had negotiations now for a number of years, and really for the last 3 years in earnest, as they've begun to negotiate on what we call a negative list basis and on protecting investments at all stages in the process. Those negotiations are continuing. I was in China recently, as you said, and had conversations with the leadership there then. The Chinese have been here since and have given us a new version of their negative list, which we're evaluating. I think the key thing is it's got to be a high standard agreement. And that means that it has to effectively open up China's economy and move it from a world in which everything is prohibited or regulated unless it's explicitly approved, to one in which everything is approved unless explicitly regulated. And that world of things that have to be regulated needs to be quite narrow and quite short. They were also going to have to deal with issues that have come up in the particular environment that China presents for investment, that issues that our investors have had there over the years. We're going to make sure we have to deal with that as well in this agreement.
Do you think that they're going to wait around to see what happens with TPP before they really get serious in doing anything?
I think all indications from President Xi on down is that they're taking this process very seriously. They're putting a lot of effort into it, and I think they'd like to try and get it done.
Okay, what I'd like to do is, right there, is to go to the audience, because I think I'd like to get a lot of participation here before Mike has to leave. So can we have a microphone over there, right up front here first?
Oh, right in front. Okay.
Right there.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. I like simple questions, and mine is, if the purpose of these trade agreements is to stimulate our exports more than imports, will you expect to see the ratio of our exports rise versus the imports that come to our nation if these are passed?
Since I'm in the halls of the IMF, filled with much better economists than I could ever aspire to be, I would simply say that most economists will tell you there are a lot of factors that go into trade balances and current account balances, including relative growth rates. And so it's hard to pinpoint in particular the impact of a trade agreement on a particular balance. What I would say is, since our average applied tariff is 1.4%, and just to give you a few examples, we face 70% tariffs on autos into some of the TPP countries, 55% on machinery, 40% on poultry, 38.5% on pork, sometimes several 100% on certain agricultural products, all of which will either be eliminated, or greatly reduced. We would expect to see more exports. And we're going to be lowering our barriers very little. Other countries are going to be lowering their barriers in a much more significant way, and at the same time raising standards.
Right there, lady in the back right there, right by the microphone.
Thank you so much. Jo Marie Griesgraber with New Rules for Global Finance, and I have two quick questions. One is, in the light of the Bretton Woods conversation, these plurilateral agreements seem to be in contradiction to the whole philosophy of the WTO organization, whereas, by avoiding or not using the WTO forum. The second question is the concern about the state dispute resolution mechanism, in which a corporation can sue a state if somehow their expected profits aren't gained. Could you speak to those two topics?
Sure. So first, on multilateralism, we continue to believe that multilateral trade liberalization is the highest and best form of trade liberalization. but that the WTO, for a whole series of reasons, when it comes to the Doha round, has reached a deadlock. And that's why at Bali, and then 2.5 years ago, and then in Nairobi in December, the WTO moved forward with, in the first case, a multilateral trade facilitation agreement. In Nairobi, an agreement on agriculture and export subsidies, but also a recognition that there was no longer a consensus that the Doha mandate, the Doha round, should continue as is, and that we should be focusing on creative ways of dealing with outstanding issues, but also new issues facing the multilateral trading system, whether it's e-commerce or small and medium-sized businesses or other issues. Our view on plurilateralism is that if between TPP and TTIP, we'll have free trade with 2/3 of the global economy, and that's before other countries who've expressed interest in potentially joining the agreements join. When you've got 2/3 of the global economy beginning to get their head around a certain set of rules, work the difficult issues domestically that allow them to open their markets and sign up to higher standards, it helps give momentum to the multilateral process as well. Because ultimately, we'd like to see those rules multilateralized, and that ultimately is the goal there. Right now, there's probably the most open, honest, frank discussion going on at the WTO in 15 years, where both ministers and our ambassadors in Geneva are really talking about what is it that we can get done multilaterally, what can't we do multilaterally but still makes sense to do plurilaterally, with the goal of having open plurilateralism that other countries will be able to join over time, and when the circumstances are right, you can ultimately multilateralize it. On investor-state dispute settlement, interestingly, TPP, over the years, I'll give 1 minute of background. There are 3,200 agreements in the world that have some form of investor-state dispute settlement. U.S. is party to 51 of them. Since 2000, we have been working in all of our subsequent agreements to reform the ISDS process by raising standards, tightening them up, adding a whole series of procedural and substantive safeguards, and then closing loopholes where we found them in other countries' agreements. One of those issues is the one you mentioned, and in TPP, it makes clear, in fact, that you cannot sue on the basis of disappointed expectations with regard to profits, that in itself, that alone, is not a basis for a suit. That's one of 24 reforms in the agreement that help make sure that ISDS is being used on what it was intended to be used for, which is for when a government comes in and expropriates property, for example, but not being used in ways that it was not intended for.
Yes, back there? Yes.
Thank you. Steve Myra with Beacon Policy Advisors. Mr. Ambassador, in the run-up to the recent U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, there were a lot of press reports of the several issues that would be on the table. One of those included the ongoing solar panel dispute and resulting polysilicon tariffs from China. However, in the fact sheets that came out, there was an emphasis on steel and some of the other issues, but I saw no mention of the solar issue. I was just wondering if you could give us a status report on where that stands. Thank you.
We did discuss it while I was there. Minister Gao, the MOFCOM minister, and I and our teams have continued to discuss that issue. It's a long-standing, outstanding dispute. It's something we'd like to try and find a way of settling. And our discussions will continue when I see Minister Gao in Shanghai in a couple of weeks.
We had a question over here. Yes, in the back, and then we'll take the one in the front.
Hi, Cam Vidler. This week, President Obama and President Nieto are going to Ottawa for the Three Amigos Summit. Canada has notably not taken a position on the TPP. I believe it's the only of 12 countries to have not stated whether it intends to ratify or not. Do you think it would be helpful for Canada to join with Mexico and the United States, make a strong statement about the TPP? Would that help with the ratification process here in the United States? And secondly, do you think that's likely?
Well, TPP was negotiated under the previous administration in Canada, and when the Trudeau administration came in, they made clear they wanted to go through a robust consultation process around the country, different sectors and different parts of the country, to make sure they had the input of a wide range of stakeholders before moving forward with TPP. And that's the process they're undergoing. We respect that decision. We respect that process. And I don't think it has a significant impact here in the United States on Congress's consideration of TPP.
Okay, right here.
I'm looking at this from a different perspective.
Just,
My name is Martin Apple. I'm a scientist representing a very large number of scientists. When we look at these kinds of things, we would say at some point, if you've got a whole bunch of people who agree on something and one who doesn't, and you were to make a decision that the whole bunch of people who agree could go ahead and do something, and the one who doesn't would have a choice of either joining at the stage they are or pulling out and seeing if they can negotiate a better deal by themselves. Would that be a feasible option?
Are you referring to the WTO or
TPP?
in Canada?
No, ours.
Ah,
The agriculture.
I see. So TPP, the intent is for all 12 countries to join together. We have procedures that are negotiated for that. If at the end of the day, not all countries, and all the TPP countries are in the process of going through their respective domestic approval processes. Some are further along in terms of ratifying it. All of them are engaged in that process now. If all 12 countries are not ready to approve it and bring it into force together, there are provisions for a subset of those countries, 6 countries representing 85% of the GDP represented by the TPP countries, to go ahead and bring it into force. What that effectively means is that US and Japan need to be part of the group that brings it into force, but we don't have to wait for all of the countries if some of them are going more slowly.
Good morning. I'm Paul Applegarth with Value Enhancement International. Come back to China, Mike. You mentioned in your opening remarks the challenges that it faces in its rebalancing. And I think it's actually the first speaker this morning that didn't accept those changes as inevitable. Or at least, when I look at what's going on in the tightening of domestic dissent and what's going on in the South China Sea, those don't look to me, those look like changes in tone, and they don't look like positive changes of tone. Have you seen the same kind of things happening in your negotiations with the Chinese around trade or not, or those continue pretty much the way that they were prior to the last couple of years?
I think we see a set of mixed data points. On the positive side, as Bill was asking, I think they're quite serious about the bilateral investment treaty process. I think there's a lot of senior level attention being paid to it to bring different parts of their government and economy in to try and chart a path forward there, and they seem to genuinely want to use it as a way of helping to drive reform in parts of their economy. Whether or not we get to the necessary high standard remains to be seen, but I do think that they are serious about putting effort into that process. At the same time, you go back and you look at the statements coming out of the third plenum a few years ago, which were very forward-leaning about reform. You look at statements about SOE reforms from a few years ago, and it's been less certain the degree to which those have been fully followed up on and implemented. So I think the record is rather mixed, and that affects the trade negotiations as well.
John Negroponte.
Yeah. Hello, Ambassador. Continuing on the subject of China, I was out there at the same time as you were. I was involved in some of the Track 2 discussions, and I once conducted the political part of the political and economic dialogue. To me, at least in the security sphere, and probably in the economic, it seems axiomatic that going forward, in the next decades, I'm not talking about just tomorrow, that the more we can work with China to accomplish global objectives, the more likely we are to be successful. And the converse of that proposition is that if we're in serious disagreement on particular questions, then it's going to be hard to get things done on a global scale. So I'm thinking of the wonderful example of the climate agreement that we reached bilaterally and then accomplished in Paris with COP 21 or 22. Do you believe in adopting an inclusive approach to China in thinking about the future of the global economic system? And then how do the things that you've been working on in the past few years, if you agree with that proposition, advance us towards that goal?
That's a very good question. The answer is yes, and I think as the second largest economy in the world, and by some measure the first largest trading economy in the world, China has a very significant national interest in the health and strength of the global trading system. And we need them to take on responsibilities commensurate with their role in the global economy. That was one of the driving forces behind the G20. It certainly is one of our efforts, one of the driving forces of our efforts within the WTO and other trade negotiations to engage with China and urge them to play a leadership role in some of these areas. Take the Information Technology Agreement negotiation. It was stuck for a long time. We reached a bilateral deal with China. It took perhaps longer than it should have to reach that deal, but once that was done, together we were able to work to bring the other parties along and reach an agreement. We're trying to do the same thing now in terms of engagement with the Chinese on the environmental goods agreement. We have countries representing 90% of the environmental goods market ready to move ahead with an agreement to eliminate tariffs on a whole range of goods, which is good for the economy, good for the environment. No country would benefit more than China in terms of both a producer of these goods and as a country that desperately needs the dispersion of environmental technologies to deal with its environmental challenges. We are urging China to come to the table and be an active party in helping to lead those negotiations to conclusion. And certainly, I'm sorry, last one, certainly at the WTO, we are always encouraging them, and they played an important role ultimately in Nairobi at the WTO ministerial, along with a handful of other countries, to help guide that process. But fundamentally, we think the rules-based system has been very good for China. They've benefited enormously from it. We think it's necessary now for China to step up and play a role with greater responsibility for that system and commensurate again with the size of its economy and its role in global trade.
One more question, Frank Vogel, because I promised to get Mike out of here by 11:15.
Very quick question.
The mic.
Very quick question. Given the political realities in the election, is the TPP going to be all or nothing in the lame duck session? Are you going to wait for then, rather than try to get politicians to commit themselves before the election?
We're working day in and day out with the leadership, the committees, individual members to lay the foundation. I think obviously it's a challenging political environment. Trade votes are always hard, by the way. They're always close. This environment is, of course, presents its own unique challenges. But we're working up on the Hill with individual members and feel very good about those conversations, that the necessary support will be there whenever the leadership determines that the appropriate window is open.
Let's give Mike a big hand for the work he's doing. Thank you.